This week, the state of Tennessee carried out its 14th execution since the death penalty became legal again here in 1978. But this one was different.
Today, by order of the Tennessee Supreme Court, the Department of Correction carried out the death sentence of Byron Lewis Black by means of lethal injection at the Riverbend Maximum Security Institution.
The execution of Byron Black was unlike any other in the country, perhaps in the world. It is the first time anyone has been put to death for a crime with a life-saving device implanted in their body. Fearing that device would attempt to shock him back to life, Black's legal team fought to have his heart defibrillator deactivated before the lethal pentobarbital flowed into his veins. A trial judge ordered that procedure be done, but the city hospital didn't want to participate. Ultimately, the state Supreme Court, the U.S. Supreme Court, and Governor Bill Lee allowed the sentence to proceed. And at 10:43, August the 5th, Byron Black died.
We got into the room and it was dark at first. Slowly we began hearing that there was some murmuring. After a while, we noticed that it was somebody praying.
We saw him in distress, and we heard him in distress.
He made the comment that it was hurting so bad.
I'm with TDOC Victim Services, and I will be making a statement on behalf of the victim's family. I thank God for making this happen. His family is going through the same thing now that we went through 37 years ago.
I represented Byron Black for 25 years. And if you think that what happened today is just about one man, you are wrong. We are witnessing the erosion of the rule of law and every principle of human decency on which this country was founded. Today, it is Byron. Tomorrow, it will be someone you care about.
The Banner covered this story as it unfolded. And today we'll hear from Stephen Hale, our criminal justice reporter, who is also the author of the book Death Row Welcomes You, and our editor, Steve Cavendish, who was one of the official media witnesses. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. It's Banner and Company. Before we talk about the punishment, let's discuss the crime. It happened in Nashville here in 1988, and I know you wrote about it, Stephen.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so Byron Black was convicted of the murders of his girlfriend at the time, Angela Clay, and her two daughters, LaToya and Lakeisha Clay. They were 9 and 6 years old. And Byron Black at the time was actually serving a 2-year jail sentence for a shooting that had occurred during an altercation between him and Angela Clay's estranged husband, a man named Benny Clay, who's the father of those two girls that were murdered. So he was actually on a work furlough for the weekend when these murders occurred. He denied that he killed them, but his story also kind of changed and his alibi kind of changed a few times, and they ended up actually arresting him after they took a bullet out of Benny Clay, the estranged husband's shoulder, and matched it. They said it matched the gun that was used in the murders, and so he ended up getting arrested and charged and tried.
At trial, his attorneys noticed that he might have had some difficulty understanding what was going on, right?
That's right, yeah. There's this very interesting bit in his clemency application that refers to this, but his original defense attorney argued that he was incompetent to stand trial because of intellectual disability. And there's a bit in the clemency application where they say that after he was convicted and after the jury left to decide on his sentence, that he leaned over to his attorney and asked, "Do I get to testify now?" And his attorney felt like he had just kind of no concept of what had been going on for, whatever it was, a week or longer in the trial, and that he had actually already been found guilty and they were just deciding whether to sentence him to death or not.
And the timing of his crime and his sentencing left him in what his attorney, Kelly Henry, described as a constitutional catch-22.
That's right. So he's convicted in 89, and then, there's the regular appeals process. But years later, I want to say 2000, 2001, there's a pair of court rulings from the state Supreme Court and the United States Supreme Court about executing people with intellectual disabilities. And at that point, Kelly Henry, who had, as you mentioned, was his attorney, kind of his post-conviction attorney for 25 years up until his execution, they filed a challenge saying under this new precedent, he should not be eligible for the death penalty. And they lost that court fight. So then fast forward, 20 some years, and the Tennessee state legislature passed a law that was actually a bipartisan law signed by a Republican governor saying updating the state's intellectual disability law and updating the legal avenue through which people could challenge their status or get a hearing on their intellectual disability status. And so then citing that law, Byron Black and his attorneys went back to court and said, under this law, which it should be noted, that law was essentially an acknowledgement that the previous law wasn't good or up to date, that it was unconstitutional. And so they went to court again and said, under this new law, Byron Black's clearly intellectually disabled. He's not eligible for the death penalty, but the way the statute is written and the courts ruled that because he had adjudicated his intellectual disability years earlier under the old law, the new law didn't apply to him. And so that's why she referred to it as a catch-22.
You get one chance to make that argument.
Right. They basically, and the way that Kelly Henry has put it in statements to the media is that, basically if he did what the courts normally tell people to do, which is if you're going to make a claim, you need to make it then. They did not delay in making his intellectual disability claim. They made it right after the Supreme Court rulings, 25 years ago. But she's saying he essentially got punished for that in a way, because if he hadn't have made those initial claims, he could have made fresh claims now and the law would have applied to him. And we've seen it apply to other men on death row who have gone to court, and courts have found them, intellectually disabled under this new standard.
Steve Cavendish, you witnessed this execution as well as the previous one in May. I see you've got something in your hands there. Are those your notes?
They are. When you enter the administration building there at Riverbend, you walk in with your driver's license and your keys. That's it. You can't take a recording device. You can't take any computers. You can't take anything. So they give you a steno pad. And so this is the second steno pad that I've gotten from the state of Tennessee. And in it are my, page and a half of notes from the execution.
This one was quite different.
It was different. When we witnessed the May execution, I told a friend of mine that if you are an advocate for the death penalty, that was probably I don't want to say perfect, but it was the ideal sort of situation. Oscar went to sleep, and from all outward appearances, you could see some color in his face change, but he didn't struggle. The difference here was that Byron Black was very clearly in distress. We entered the witness chamber a few minutes before 10:30, and it's a weird experience. You sit there in the dark, and you're in a room that has windows into the execution chamber. And there's two witness rooms. There's media witnesses, and then there's a perpendicular to us on the kind of the sidewall is a room where the family members who wanted to witness could watch the execution. And so you're sitting there in the dark, and then about 10:30, the curtains open, and they've begun the administration of the pentobarbital. And at 10:32, I have in my notes that Byron Black raised his head and exhaled during a prayer that his spiritual advisor Monica Coakley was saying, and she was essentially administering the funeral rites in the Episcopal from the Episcopal Church. She was using if you're Episcopalian, she was using the Book of Common Prayer, and was working through that service. And we'd heard some of that before they opened the windows, and then she was finishing that as the pentobarbital was administered. At 10:33, he raised his head and he said, "Oh, this is hurting so bad." And Reverend Coakley looked at him and said, "I'm so sorry." And she told him to just concentrate on her voice. There was other groaning there in the next sort of 30 seconds, and Coakley began singing to comfort him. At 10:35, he raised his head and groaned again. And we don't know exactly why he was groaning. There are two possible explanations. The pentobarbital causes pulmonary edema. It creates sort of the effect that you're drowning, and it's fluid in your lungs, and you're drowning in your own fluid. But then he had a defibrillator installed, pacemaker / defibrillator, that was installed by the state last year. And this was the subject of significant litigation in the weeks going up to the execution. Henry and her team had argued in Chancery Court and then all the way up to the state Supreme Court about what was going to happen. And they were the ones that introduced like significant medical experts at that trial. I mean, if you look at the record, there really is no sort of opposition to this. That when his heart was beginning to slow from the pentobarbital, he was being shocked by a device implanted already in his chest. At 10:36, I have in my notes here that this is about the time that the pentobarbital was fully administered, and he had become sort of non-responsive. And if you talk to experts, and I think Henry talked about this in the post-execution press conference, we don't know if he was conscious or not. He may have still had consciousness, but he was not responsive. And so he was laying there on the gurney as Coakley offered a prayer for the victims of his crime. At 10:39, I have in my notes that his head tilted back and to the left towards Coakley, and his breathing had slowed, and then it stopped. And then at 10:41, the curtain closed, roughly 10 minutes after it had opened. He was laying on the gurney. Try to tell you kind of exactly what it looked like inside the execution chamber. He had two heavy straps across his chest, so it was hard to watch his breathing. There was a group of 7 media witnesses. It was myself, someone from the Tennessean, someone from the Associated Press, and then the rest were from broadcast stations here in town. All of us there, all of us in the same situation, all of us with brand new steno pads and pens from the state to take our notes. And we all sort of agreed that it was hard to tell when he had stopped breathing, but clearly he had by the time that the curtain closed. At 10:43, they said a Dr. Fowler, which I don't know if they meant to say that or not, but a Dr. Fowler pronounced him dead and said that he had no pulse and he was not breathing. And then these things usually conclude, and we're listening to this over an intercom that pipes sound in, usually concludes with the sentence of the state of Tennessee has been completed.
It's Banner and Company. I'm Demetria Kalodimos. We'll be right back.
At New Balance, we believe if you run, you're a runner. However you choose to do it. Because when you're not worried about doing things the right way, you're free to discover your way. And that's what running is all about. Run your way at newbalance.com/running.
You did mention one doctor's name, but Stephen, in reporting on the various legal maneuvers and the medical ethics issues in this case, no one seemed to want to comment, did they?
Yeah, so Steve mentioned the defibrillator in Byron Black's chest. The litigation ahead of the execution was brought about because his attorneys were arguing that the state needed to have that deactivated before he was executed so that the shocks that Steve mentioned wouldn't happen, which itself created kind of a bizarre argument because they weren't really, obviously his attorneys didn't want him to be executed, but in these legal filings, they weren't saying you can't execute him. They were just saying if you're going to execute him, you have to take this step so that it's not cruel and unusual punishment, essentially. And yeah, we kind of tried to check around to see if we could find folks who, whether they're academic or otherwise, kind of look at medical ethics issues. The AMA, the American Medical Association, has some documents about participation in executions, which essentially say that doctors, must not participate in executions. There are various things along the edges where it's there's kind of reasons that you could be a part of the process, but not in terms of actually participating in executing someone. But this was sort of a strange situation because, and I did talk to one professor who was just kind of thinking through it with me, who said, on the one hand, as a doctor or a medical professional, you would almost certainly ethically not be permitted to participate in an execution. And so by removing this device or helping to deactivate it, you would arguably be facilitating the execution. And so it seems that no one was willing to do it. I guess we haven't said explicitly, but I mean, no, the state ended up not being able to get anyone who was willing or came forward to say, I'll deactivate that device.
But the state did say at one point that the city's general hospital was going to participate.
They did, and this is another little wrinkle here. They said in, attorneys from the Attorney General's office said in court filings that providers at General Hospital were not willing to come to the prison to deactivate the device, but that they would do it at the hospital. And they put this in court filings. And so the judge modified his order and said, okay, do it that way. You can bring him to the hospital the morning of the execution. You can deactivate the device. You can bring him back to the prison and do the execution. But subsequently, I reached out and other reporters reached out to General Hospital to try to talk to them about this. Why were they willing to do it, or what was their thinking about this? And the answer we got back was, we are not willing to do that. Now, all the internal back and forth that happened there is not totally clear to us. But the most clarification we got was that the prison officials, whoever they talked to, they didn't run it all the way up the chain. And so at some point, the leadership of the hospital must have said, we're actually not going to allow this to happen at the hospital. And so then the state just ended up appealing to the Tennessee Supreme Court and saying, we don't think we should have to deactivate this device at all. And that's where it ended up.
What's interesting is in filings, there are concurrent conversations. The medical provider, I think their name is Centurion, was having internal discussions as well. And when their legal team got kind of wind of what the plan was, they backed them off. And so they had to go directly to the hospital. The state had to go directly to the hospital in order to turn off the defibrillator. At that point, the hospital's board, because of questions that were coming externally, said we're not participating in this at all. And there was a lot. It's clear from filings that there was a lot of discussion behind the scenes of these very heavy ethical sort of obligations that doctors have about not committing harm against a patient.
Yeah. And it does get to one of many kind of strange, I don't even know what the word is, dilemmas or strange kind of parts of the death penalty, because, as we were saying, you might arguably say that for a medical professional to deactivate this device, they would be clearing the way for the state to execute him. And so there's a sense in which they would be participating in the execution. But then on the flip side, once the state said, we're going to execute him regardless, and this is what the professor I spoke to was saying, who was talking about the medical ethics view of this sort of philosophically, is once the state has said, we're going to execute him either way, a medical professional might, in good conscience, say, well, I'm going to reduce his suffering by deactivating this device because they're going to kill him anyway. It's a very strange thing. And as far as I can tell, I mean, I don't know if this is completely unprecedented in death penalty cases, but I have not come across a case like this. And I think Kelly Henry, in one of her filings, said that this specific issue about a defibrillator had not been litigated. So I don't really know if there's another comparison to this.
There's another sort of ethical kind of discussion that's going on behind this, which is, okay, why didn't you just turn off the defibrillator a week beforehand? They had said, okay, we're set this up at 4 a.m. We're gonna deactivate the defibrillator for a 10 o'clock execution. And the problem is that Byron Black needed the defibrillator to stay alive.
Right.
It had been implanted in him the year before. This is a man who I believe was suffering from some stage of renal failure. He'd had he could barely stand. In order to get to the execution chamber, he had to be sort of helped out of his bed and onto the gurney where he was then strapped down. There's a whole set of questions about why is the state doing this to keep him alive in order to execute him? Why not just let him die? The number of people, Tennessee has a very old death row. The number of people who have died here in recent years is climbing, who died naturally on death row. And Byron Black was a very sick man. And so this whole set of questions around how much are we spending to keep these people alive so that we can then jump through the hoops of finding a drug on a gray market somewhere, because the state can't buy the pentobarbital directly from the manufacturer because they don't want it used for this purpose, and jump through all of these other sort of hoops in order to execute him. Why not just let Byron Black die? He was going to die soon anyway, and if he'd never had the defibrillator put in, certainly he might have been dead, a year and a half ago.
Yeah, actually, for the record, in the last 12 years, there have been 12 men die naturally on death row waiting for their executions. And 3 men have been released due to wrongful conviction. There have also been those who have gotten cancer treatment, various surgeries, other medical interventions.
Yeah, and I'm just, as Steve was talking, I was thinking maybe we should say this out loud, because I'm sure it's something we've all seen in our emails. I know I have already this week, which is people who will say, understandably, okay, well, we're talking about Byron Black's physical condition and how painful his execution might have been. Angela Clay and her 2 daughters were shot to death in their bedrooms, and that was not a consideration for them, which is obviously true. So it's maybe just worth saying that once we decided, which was many, many years ago in this country, that we weren't going to, forgive me for being blunt, but just shoot someone in the head after they're convicted of a murder and sentenced to death. Once we decided we weren't going to do it immediately, all these issues were bound to come up, because there are going to be, there's due process, then there's going to be arguments about, we have a constitution that says, you're not allowed cruel and unusual punishment, so then there's going to be arguments about that. So it may seem to some people when they listen to this like it's a little in the weeds, but it's kind of unavoidable. If the state's going to execute people, there's going to be fights about this. You can't really get away from it.
It's Banner and Company, and my guests are Banner criminal justice reporter Stephen Hale and editor-in-chief Steve Cavendish. We'll be right back. Back in 2022, Vanderbilt did what I think is the most recent poll on the attitudes toward capital punishment here in Tennessee, and more than half of Tennesseans would prefer to see life in prison without parole.
After I left the execution, driving home, and I called one of my best friends, guy who's been a defense attorney for years, also one of the most conservative people I know. And I called him because I knew that he would provide kind of some of the right perspective on this. And we got to talking about that. And what he said to me was, Steve, if you are sentenced to life in prison, that's 60 years. If you get every good time credit possible, it's 51 years. 51 years in prison. That is a death sentence for almost anybody. He said, when you tell people that, there's this perception that people they can get half off of their sentences. And Tennessee has dramatically reduced kind of the amount of credit that you can get for good behavior in prison, and certainly for the most serious crimes, you're doing substantial amounts of that time. And what he said to me was, this is maybe one of the most conservative people I know, but also he's an ardent opponent of the death penalty. And he said, there's just no reason for it. And he said, more and more people will probably come around to that the more they get acquainted with exactly how Tennessee punishes people. He said, you can't look at life in prison as anything but a death sentence. And if the difference between, and what he was saying to me was, if the difference between it is, are we going to kill them or are they going to die on their own? Why not let them die on their own? And I think that there is the way that the numbers have moved in Tennessee reflect some of that. And I would not expect those numbers to change dramatically in the other direction. Public opinion changes for a lot of different reasons, but this is pretty much I think the only way opinion is going to move. If it's 60% or 70%, that wouldn't surprise me at some point. I just don't think you're going to see a overwhelming majority of Tennesseans say the death penalty is preferable to life in prison.
Yeah, I think another factor, obviously this is somewhat anecdotal, but I mean, in my life, when I bring up this topic comes up and I talk about how I've written about it or how we cover it, it's pretty odd to most people. Most people don't walk around thinking about the death penalty, I think probably for good reasons. And I think one reason that is they have busy lives. They're not thinking about this kind of grim stuff. But the other reason is we don't actually do this very often, historically speaking. If you look at the numbers of executions every year, even though they're a bit up this year from recent years, but nationally speaking, the number of executions has been on a downward trajectory for 30 years. And so this is just not a normal, there's not some drumbeat of executions going on. And there's also not a lot of people being sentenced to death, even for new crimes, for recent crimes. So this is just not a thing we're, generally speaking, doing that much. And I think that's kind of reflected in how people think about it. And it also, I think, reflects a sort of decrease in our willingness to actually say this person should be executed. You know, when if you look at the numbers of new death sentences, they're very low now. I mean, what we have is a situation where a lot of people are on death row, like Byron Black. They've been there 30, almost 40 years. And if they committed the same crime today, it's very, very likely that they would be sentenced to life without parole or life in prison or something. But because of the era when they committed it, they got a sentence that we're largely avoiding now. And that's kind of a strange situation. You know, I mean, it's I don't have a perfect answer for it, but it's a peculiar state of affairs.
There's a perverse sort of effect going on here, which is that as we prosecute people and try to go for the death penalty less, you realize that the application of that is much more a function of prosecutorial discretion. And so you may commit the crime in different jurisdictions, and it's completely up to whether a prosecutor there happens to want to go for the death penalty or not. And increasingly, prosecutors have looked at these cases as expensive, and prosecutors, and I think this is true kind of across the spectrum, across the ideological spectrum. Prosecutors have looked at this as what is the kind of cost benefit of seeking the death penalty. It's going to require many more resources from their office. This person is going to be in jail for decades after the prosecutor has left office. They don't see really the effect as any different.
This very argument was made out in Idaho with the college killings.
Yeah.
And some people thought if there ever was a death penalty case, that seemed to be one, but it wasn't on the table.
I was just going to say that, a lot of folks who, whether they're public officials or just people that you talk to, citizens, if they think the death penalty is a good policy or at least a defensible one, what they'll say is, well, there are some crimes that are just so heinous, and there's almost a philosophical argument that we cannot exist alongside this person anymore. It's not even good enough for them to be away. They have to go away. And there's a sense in which you can see the logic of that, but the application, as you're saying, is that we don't execute the worst of the worst people. I mean, Byron Black, again, he contested his guilt, but he was convicted of killing a mother and her 2 daughters. It's hard to think of a worse thing to do. But with that said, there are people who have killed 4 people, 5 people, 6 people in this state who are in prisons and are not going to be executed. So you do get to a situation like Steve was saying, where it's more about where you did it, who the victim was, and things like that. And that feels harder to defend.
Bill Lee has now, I believe, presided over more executions than any other governor in modern time, with 6. Will this be an issue in the upcoming race for governor?
I don't think so. I would like to tell you that the Tennesseans are going to have a robust conversation around the death penalty, but I think it's very easy for political candidates to embrace the death penalty because I don't think there's any penalty against it. I don't think people are going to vote against someone in the middle or on the right because they happen to be for or against the death penalty. If you're on the political left, it's probably a non-starter for you. But in Tennessee, the numbers would certainly say that you're not going to be penalized for being for the death penalty.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. I mean, it would be, for one thing, again, going back to how by numbers, even though it's obviously a very heavy topic and policy decision, it's not happening that much. It doesn't affect that many people. And so, it's just not a thing that's likely to come up a lot. And I don't think there's a high political price to be paid for it. I always wonder if that, and I guess I don't know, but I always wonder if that's also true the other way. If Governor Bill Lee came out tomorrow and said, we're just not going to do this anymore, feels like it'd be a few days of news and even Tennessee Republicans would just kind of move on. I could be wrong about that, but it's just not clear to me that it's a super animating thing one way or another. It gets a lot of discussion when it happens, right? We're talking about it right now. There's news coverage. There's people arguing about it. I'm sure if you got into a political debate about it on a campaign, there would be back and forth, but I just am not convinced that it moves people at scale one way or another that much,
There's an opportunity for official witnesses and representatives of the families to talk after these executions. But did you have additional time to talk to the victims' families?
That's right. So in that post-execution press conference, there were some statements from family members of the victims, but me and our colleague Lilly, we were also out in the field, kind of outside the prison where there's space for demonstrators, either for or against the death penalty or for or against the execution, to be there. And there were some family members of LaToya and Lakeisha Clay, some 2 women who were their cousins. And it was very striking to talk to them. We got to talk to them a little bit, in part because they were children, just like LaToya and Lakeisha, when this crime occurred. And of course, they're adults now, and those two girls would have been in their 40s now. So that was very kind of striking to think about. But we did talk to them, and they said, and I think this is important to note, because there are victims' family members, as you know, that are all across the spectrum on this. We've had cases where the victim's family has come out and said, we don't want to see an execution. This isn't going to do anything for us. This family members, and this was reflected in their statements after the execution at the press conference too, they told us it was a celebration, I think in one part because they felt they were getting justice for their family, but they also said, they talked about how long they've been waiting for this to be done with. And, this case has been going on almost 40 years, 38 years or something like that. And so both of them had signs that said long time coming, and they said, we're ready to be done with this process, because they have seen Byron Black. This was his third execution date in the past 5 years, I think. So twice before they've seen him scheduled for execution and then seen it moved. And there's just, for victims' families, this process does get dragged out very long too. So it was interesting to hear that from them. Yeah.
And you and I both have spent some time inside Unit 2, which is death row. And it's interesting to sort of talk about the solidarity movement that happens inside. I know on the Sundays before executions, they have these marches for mercy on the outside. And on the inside, the inmates that want to take part actually do laps in their pod, and they march the equivalent of 8 miles in solidarity with people on the outside.
Right.
They're very conscious of who's next and what's hanging over everyone's head.
Yes, and we heard from several people that, Byron Black was being very closely cared for by other inmates on Unit 2 because of his physical condition. So there were a couple guys in there who were, sort of helping him do everything because of the state he was in. I should also mention, when we're talking about family members, the march that you talked about on Sunday on the outside, Byron Black's son marched with them as well for that. So, he had family members who I don't know if they were present at the execution or not, but who were around and who were talking to people about him and were affected by this too.
Banner and Company is a production of the New Nashville Banner. This episode was produced by Lilly Sabella with assistance from Steve Haruch. Edited and mixed by me. Our theme music is by Verlin Thompson. Subscribe wherever you get your podcasts or go to NashvilleBanner.com. You're in good company.